Here lie the bones of a small man, who almost 200 years after his death, still casts a very long shadow. Napoleon Bonaparte.
He was in many ways a genius, not just a military genius, but also an intellectual giant.
He was a gambler. He had an eye for the main chance.
He was one of the first people in modern times to understand the concept of celebrity. You spin a myth to subsume a myth. You keep moving on.
Bonaparte spun his myth through the power of words. I have been called upon to change the face of the world, he said. He saw himself as a man of destiny, his fate marked out by the stars. But all his dreams finally fell to earth in a muddy field in Belgium, an anonymous piece of farmland that we now call Waterloo. On June the 18th, 1815, this was a small and tightly packed killing field. 200,000 combatants in an area less than 2 miles square. At the end of a half day of slaughter, 1 in 4 lay dead or dying. This carnage finally marked the end of Napoleon Bonaparte's ambitions. But why did so many have to die? What was it about this one man that brought them here? Just 14 months before Waterloo, in April 1814, Europe had at last appeared to be free of war. Napoleon, after 10 years as emperor, had been forced to give up the throne of France. In his despair, he had tried to kill himself, but in this too, he failed. His exile to the Mediterranean island of Elba seemed to have brought to an end more than 20 years of bloodshed. 6 million men had died in wars across a dozen countries. The absolute master of Europe now found his dominion shrunk to this tiny island. He was allowed the trappings of a head of state, but not the freedom to leave his kingdom.
He was appointed the perfectly legal sovereign of Elba, and he was still a general. He's allowed an army, it's only 1,200 strong. He's allowed some guns. He's even allowed a frigate. But I suppose if you've been emperor of the French and ruler of the whole of Europe, being the mayor of Reigate is really not much of a consolation.
He still clung to the title of emperor, but at the age of 45, Bonaparte was balding, fat and frightened. His life had come full circle. Just across the straits was his birthplace, Corsica, where he had grown up hating France, the country that he would one day rule. He had graduated from military academy in France as a lowly artillery officer, but the turmoil of the French Revolution had changed everything. As the Bourbon king's head fell, so Bonaparte's career prospects began to rise.
Napoleon Bonaparte is a child of the revolution. He owes his advancement to that. He progresses rapidly through the revolutionary armies largely because he is one of the few professionals who actually knows his business at a time when the French revolutionary armies were little more than an armed rabble.
Revolutions are ideal times for soldiers with a bit of wit and the courage to act, Napoleon had said. But these alone don't explain the speed of his rise to power. He had a knack of being lucky, and never more so than when he took a chance on the aristocratic Josephine Beauharnais. If Napoleon was a child of the Revolution, Josephine, just 6 years older, was already its widow. She had lost her husband to the guillotine and only narrowly escaped herself. At 32, The mother of 2 children, she had become a survivor, cultivating powerful men in the revolutionary government, happy to be their plaything.
She'd really made her name as an it girl, a party girl, one of the most beautiful women in Paris. And Napoleon was just not dead by her. He had a complex about his height. He wasn't as small as people say, but he was a lot smaller than Josephine. But Napoleon was so enthralled by her, I don't think that bothered him.
Josephine combined sex and power, the perfect woman for Bonaparte. The little outsider from Corsica was soon at the heart of government.
He said to Josephine after his first night that you set my blood on fire. But that's not why he married her. He married her because of the network.
Josephine's network of high-ranking men gave Bonaparte the leg up he needed. The revolution had bathed France in blood. Now they needed to wipe out that memory. How better than by waging war abroad? Napoleon was happy to oblige. In Italy, Egypt, Germany, Austria, and Spain. He was a superb commander, and in victory after victory subdued Europe for the glory of France. The butcher's bill was high, but his adopted country could afford it.
He's very extravagant with his soldiers. Very often these great triumphs, these great gambles, these great throws that he makes, also involve throwing away an awful lot of soldiers' lives. But he had a huge army. He was able to obtain troops from all over Europe. So casualties in Napoleon's book didn't really matter very much.
In 1804, Bonaparte had declared himself emperor, with Josephine as his consort. He was ruler of the largest empire in Europe since the Romans. But that wasn't enough. He wanted a royal dynasty to succeed him, and he needed a son. Josephine tried to oblige.
Napoleon had always wondered whether he was impotent. He took a mistress in Poland by whom he had a son, which proved him wrong. So from that moment on, really, Josephine's cards were marked.
Josephine had delivered an empire to Napoleon, but it was clear at the age of 46 that she could never give him an heir. So he divorced her.
He did this with some regret, because there was still a lingering memory of what they had had together. But nonetheless, it was an overwhelming political need for him to marry again and have an heir, which he did when he made the staggeringly impressive dynastic marriage to Marie-Louise, the daughter of the Emperor of Austria.
Bonaparte was 40 years old. Marie-Louise, just 19. He'd wanted new blood for the Bonaparte dynasty and had found a blue blood. Marie-Louise was descended from the House of Habsburg and the Holy Roman Empire. She was young, but she had a pedigree 1,000 years old.
Marrying into the oldest imperial family in the world must surely have an effect on the way in which he perceives himself and his family. And perhaps this is a new 1,000-year Reich that Napoleon is going to establish. I wouldn't put it beyond him.
Within a year, Marie-Louise had given birth to the son and heir that Bonaparte craved. There could only be one name for the baby, but this new Napoleon was also given a title to reflect his mother's bloodline and his father's ambition. The child would be known as the King of Rome. Yet now, on Elba, 4 years later, Bonaparte found himself exiled, both from his country and his family.
He's a passionate Corsican who has lost his wife and his son. This drives him into a wholly Corsican fury.
He pleaded with Marie-Louise. No one has any right to stand in the way of your coming. I am longing to see you and my son too. Your apartments are ready. But the apartment stood empty. The pain of the separation represented by 2 fluttering doves bound by an ever-tightening silk ribbon.
Napoleon was writing desperately to Marie-Louise, But what he didn't know, and what nobody knew until the letters were discovered several years ago, was that Marie-Louise herself had been writing furiously to Napoleon saying, "Tell me how to get to you. I've got your son. We'll come." Those letters were intercepted, and Napoleon never knew, ever, for the rest of his life, that Marie-Louise had been loyal to him. Ever.
It was Marie-Louise's father, the Emperor of Austria, who was intercepting their letters. As Emperor of France, Bonaparte had seemed a fine match. In exile, he was nothing. Little by little, he was being cut off from all that he loved. His last parting from Josephine, too, had been difficult. Farewell, Josephine. Be content as I am, and never forget one who has never forgotten and never will forget you. Within 3 weeks of Napoleon arriving on Elba, Josephine became ill and died. Her last words, Bonaparte, Elba, the King of Rome. Bonaparte learned of her death only from a newspaper. He locked himself away for 2 days. I have not passed a day without loving you. I have not passed a night without clasping you in my arms. No woman was ever loved with more devotion, ardor, and tenderness. In the grief of Bonaparte's exile lay the seeds of self-delusion that would lead within the year to Waterloo, and his encounter with an Englishman who would prove his nemesis, Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington. When he'd landed on Elba, Bonaparte had said he would make it an island of tranquility. Now he poured his frustrated energies into shaking it up. His pocket kingdom was no paradise, just a dusty backwater, too poor to feed itself. In a flurry of proclamations, Napoleon set out to drag it into the 19th century, to exploit its mineral wealth, granite, iron, and lead, to irrigate the lowlands, reforest the hills, and build new roads.
Napoleon was a man of reason, with a tendency to think in terms of straight lines. When he had come to Paris for the first time, he had been absolutely bowled over by the straight lines, which seemed to represent to him the very idea of modernity. But the streets weren't straight, the ports weren't square, the fields weren't properly measured. Napoleon was a rational man, and the ideal of a straight line is basically the ideal of progress.
And in his quest for progress, no detail escaped him. He even decreed to his astonished new citizens that no more than 5 must sleep in one bed.
Napoleon was a man who knew how to keep busy. But to be occupied is not at all the same as to be satisfied. I think that's a major key to Napoleon's character.
There was a particular bitterness for Bonaparte in his exile. While he was far from France and those he loved, the Englishman who had defeated his armies was right at his heart. The Duke of Wellington had been appointed British ambassador to the court of the Bourbon King Louis XVIII. And it seemed to Bonaparte, Wellington was cocking a snook. He'd taken over one of the Bonaparte family homes as his embassy, and there he was living life to the full. Bonaparte's life.
Whilst Napoleon was cooped up on Elba, Wellington was enjoying himself hugely in Paris. He hired Napoleon's cook. He also had his watches and swords made by Napoleon's watch and sword maker, and it seems more than accidental that Wellington should have slept with two of Napoleon's mistresses.
There was some comfort for Bonaparte. King Louis, known to his subjects as Fat Louis, was already treading on a few toes. His brother had lost his crown and his head in the revolution, but Louis was undeterred. Newly returned from his own exile in England, he wanted to turn the clock back for France, to abandon the changes of the past 2 decades. It was earning him enemies.
Had he come back and recognized that French society had changed, he might well have been able to rule over a contented, united and happy country, most of whose citizens, of course, had known nothing else but war for the previous 20-odd years. But he didn't do that.
All Europe was peace-mad after the long wars, nowhere more so than in Vienna. Here the men responsible for Bonaparte's exile had gathered to perform the last rites over his empire. No single country had defeated him. It had taken all the great powers to bring him down. He had torn up the map of their old Europe, and they were struggling to piece together a new one, struggling among many distractions.
In addition to the negotiations and talks, there are gala dinners, balls, just non-stop fun and games for everybody. In fact, this was one of the aspects of the Congress which attracted a lot of public criticism. People felt that this suggested that the decisions being made at Vienna were being made in a frivolous, a thoughtless, inconsiderate atmosphere.
As the year turned, Bonaparte's frustration grew. In his abdication treaty, France had promised a pension of 2 million francs a year. It received nothing. Funds were running low. In Vienna, the peace negotiations became frostier as the winter wore on. The stakes were rising in the race for territory. Cracks were appearing in the Allied show of unity.
Despite all this fun and games, the atmosphere was extremely tense. Russia and Prussia had come to an agreement about the future of Poland and Saxony. And the deal was the Russians should get Poland and the Prussians should get Saxony, as simple as that. However, neither the Austrians nor the British were going to buy this. And of course, this caused very bitter ill feeling.
On Elba, Bonaparte learned of the rift between the British and the Prussians, and in it he saw the glimpse of an opportunity, a chance to divide his enemies and fulfill his destiny. He had been on his island kingdom for just 10 months. Of the countless orders he'd signed, he'd seen just one pet project completed, a revealing one. He'd built his own theater. As a soldier, he'd had the swagger of a theatrical hero. As a statesman, he was an impresario. But every actor needs an audience, and the novelty of his Mediterranean statelet had worn thin. The real drama was happening in Paris and Vienna. It was time for Bonaparte to make a comeback. As he set sail, Bonaparte was embarking on his biggest scandal yet. All France misses me and wants me, he said. I shall reach Paris without firing a shot. He only had 1,000 troops, but he set them to work, writing out proclamations to win over the rest of his old army. Soldiers, we have not been defeated. In my exile, I have heard your voice. Your general has returned. It was 2 days before Bonaparte reached France, making landfall near Cannes in the Bay of Gauchelin. Here would begin his new assault on posterity. Every step would be burned into French folk memory as the route Napoleon.
Il a débarqué ici à Golfe-Juan. Il a passé une nuit là, la fenêtre qui est entrebâillée, au premier étage. Par ses actions, ses guerres, ça a marqué un grand empire pour les Français. L'histoire de France, les Français sont très attachés. Napoléon, c'est l'histoire de France.
Bonaparte found few fans here in 1815. The south of France was royalist territory. 10 months before, on his way into exile, he'd narrowly escaped a lynching here. Little had changed. His glorious return now became cautious. He would avoid major cities and lead his pocket army through the Alps. Before the day was out, his plan came unstuck. Abruptly, his roads disappeared. The highway had been on his map. He'd issued a decree for its construction a dozen years before, but it hadn't even been started. It was one thing to give out orders, another to follow them through. Bonaparte wasn't deterred. He ordered his troops up the rocky slopes.
When he's faced with the most terrible problems, it's absolutely essential to maintain the momentum. The moment he stops, his cause is lost, so he's got to keep on moving.
Everything superfluous was ditched: cannons, ammunition, and supply wagons. Bonaparte's Polish lancers even had to shoulder their own sabots. What he wouldn't abandon were his proclamations and the band's big drum. These were the weapons to rally France. But the obstacles ahead were formidable. None more so than the stronghold at Sisteron, some 80 miles away. The bridge here, across the fast-flowing river Durance, was a key objective for Bonaparte. To reach Paris, he would have to cross the river, right under the guns of the citadel. It was a race against the clock. Messengers would already be carrying reports of his landing to the king in Paris. What his troops must do, he said, was march faster than the news. Get into friendly territory before Louis's armies could corner them. His men were making good time. 60 miles in 24 hours. They'd had just 3 hours sleep. Another day's march, he thought, should get them to Sisteron.
He's moving cautiously, he's moving at night, having to sneak back into France. But the most remarkable thing is how he turned adversity to his advantage, because he can suddenly appear out of the wilderness, as if from nowhere.
But the reaction to Bonaparte's sudden reappearance was not encouraging.
Ici à Barème, il est passé, oui. C'est un tyran. Et il nous a saigné. Il a saigné la France avec ses guerres. Mais il avait une personnalité, ça c'est sûr. Hein. Comme le Français aime bien la gloriole un petit peu, quoi. Hein. Il faut dire, hein. Il était très fort pour haranguer les foules.
Bonaparte's persuasive powers were stretched to breaking. Requisitioning the house of Barenne's magistrate, a Monsieur Tatenson, he claimed to have a huge invasion force behind him. The whole French army is on my side. The Bourbons will never hold on. Even if the troops are for you, replied Tartanson, the people are not. A reply which Bonaparte ignored. And when he saw Tartanson's grandchild, he began to weep, remembering his own son, the King of Rome. By March 20th, his birthday, I'll be sleeping in Paris. His mother, the Empress, is also on her way. We shall arrive there together. He hadn't heard from them for almost 6 months. Now his troops were marching above the snow line on paths that were increasingly treacherous. He'd been told this route to Sisteron was impossible, a word he didn't like to hear.
He crosses the mountains under conditions that could be compared to Hannibal going across the Alps 2,000 years earlier. It's an incredibly steep route, and in winter it's an amazingly dangerous route.
Nothing, it seemed, could dent his self-belief. Approaching towns, his advance guard would ride ahead, demanding rations for 5,000 hungry troops. In fact, he had only a fifth of that number. But the ruse was enough to kill any thought of resistance. At the spa town of Digne-les-Bains, the citizens had demanded weapons from the mayor to fight Bonaparte and his bedraggled followers. They were refused. He entered Digne by its narrowest street, Mère de Dieu, Mother of God, to be met by sullen silence. As the drums of the Imperial Guard echoed from the walls, the townspeople looked on, cowed and suspicious. Then they turned away. In 4 days, he had gathered just 5 recruits to his new Imperial army. 2 veterans, 2 deserters, and 1 gendarme. For the first time, he seemed disconcerted. They showed no joy at seeing me. Can it be we've been fooling ourselves? Are the troops not on our side? This moment of realism quickly passed. That same day, to Marie-Louise, he wrote, "I am adored and master of everything. All I lack is you, my good Louise, and my son." His race against the clock was becoming a race against his demons. Fear of reality, fear of failure. It would spur him all the way to Waterloo. In their march through the Alps, Bonaparte and his troops were struggling to keep the element of surprise. News of the Emperor's landing had taken 4 days to travel by courier, but horsepower was giving way to a new technology that he developed as Emperor, the telegraph. Now Paris would hear of his return within the day. The king's response to the news was sober. It's another revolution. His Minister for War, Nicolas Soult, mobilized 180,000 troops to deal with Napoleon's little band, proclaiming, "That man Bonaparte has landed once more on French soil. What does he want? Civil war? What is he looking for? Traitors." As a turncoat himself, Soult had good reason to worry. Until the previous year, he had been one of Bonaparte's most trusted marshals. Who knows what retribution he might be after. The army's commander-in-chief, the hot-headed Marshal Ney, was in the same quandary. Having switched sides once, he was desperate to show his loyalty to the king. He vowed to bring the Corsican upstart back to Paris in an iron cage. The upstart was leading his disheveled army down from the mountains to Sisteron. He found horses for the cavalry, but his troops were trailing along, exhausted. Above was Napoleon's personal banner, the flag of Elba, and someone had found an eagle, a reminder of the glory days of empire. Once again, word of Bonaparte's approach went ahead of him, and once again, the word was enough. The garrison in the citadel melted away. For them to blow the bridge over the River Durance would have taken only minutes. But now, time was with Bonaparte. When he saw the bridge undamaged, he couldn't hide his relief. "Gentlemen," We are as good as in Paris. In Paris, the king was anxious. Everything depends on the 1st Regiment to confront him, he said. That moment was drawing closer. The countryside outside Grenoble was no stranger to political drama. This was where, 25 years before, the French Revolution had broken out. But there was little revolutionary fervor to cheer Bonaparte now. His 6-day march through the mountains had left him weary and run down. At the village of Le Fray, the highway is squeezed between a lake on one hand and steep hills on the other. And here, Bonaparte and his men must halt. Facing them is the 5th Regiment of the line. They wear the white cockade. These are the king's troops.
Napoleon knew that once confronted, he could not back down whatever the result.
Bonaparte has a simple choice. He can fight, or he can retreat. But Bonaparte is Bonaparte, and he might choose to do neither. He might just gamble. The Marseillaise for Napoleon was the greatest general of the revolution. Now he displays the tricolour to soldiers who once pledged their loyalty to France and to him. Only then does he walk forward, alone.
It really does say everything about Napoleon as gambler, as showman, but also as military leader.
He is said to have walked to the front and opened his coat.
To reveal his green chasseur uniform.
He actually opened his coat and pointed to his heart and said,
If there is a single soldier among you who wants to kill me, here I am.
Soldats du 5e, vous me reconnaissez? Si quelqu'un veut tuer son empereur, me voici.
Bonaparte's audacity put the 5th Regiment in his pocket. But it gave him something greater still. Confidence. He could still work his old magic. If he could win over the army, he could win back the country. And then, who knows? His ambitions were never modest. As far as Grenoble, I was nothing but an adventurer, he wrote. After Grenoble, I became a prince.
it was the crucial psychological moment for him and for France, because this was the point at which everybody realised that in fact he was going to be accepted back, and they were going to embark on this great adventure in the face of opposition from the whole of Europe.
Bonaparte had made one serious misjudgment. He had counted on the friction at the Congress of Vienna, leading to its collapse. Just weeks before, disputes over territory had almost brought the Allies to war. They patched together an uneasy peace. And Britain had a new representative in Vienna, a man who was becoming a thorn in Bonaparte's side, the Duke of Wellington. When the Duke heard of Bonaparte's landing, he'd already been marching a week. Wellington, never a demonstrative man, took pains to appear unmoved. Others followed his cue.
There was a big difference between the public and the private reaction. Publicly, they claimed that they laughed it off. Privately, however, and in reality, they were an awful lot more worried than that.
Napoleon's return spreads absolute terror. I don't think the word is too strong. They have now seen what he's made of. This was something they really believed had gone away. They had never had to deal with someone like Napoleon. Europe had never seen a phenomenon like Napoleon. What do you do with such a person? This is unprecedented. You can't make peace with him because he's shown you he won't make peace. He's also shown you that he can come back from the dead.
Tsar Alexander of Russia was one of the few in Vienna who didn't hide his fears. To Wellington he said simply, "It's for you to save the world again."
When the Congress in Vienna discover that the hound has slipped the leash and Napoleon has removed himself from Elba, all eyes turn to Wellington. Wellington is known to every ruler in Europe. He's the one general that's consistently beaten the French, from the one country that has consistently been opposed to the French.
Wellington had earned his reputation fighting the French in Spain, a conflict so bitter that Napoleon called it his Spanish ulcer. He was born in the same year as Bonaparte. Unlike his rival, though, Wellington was an austere man, for whom war was a serious business. He never gambled.
Wellington was a taciturn man. He was brought up to lead, and he had a strong sense of his own aristocratic background and bearing, and he thought of himself as primarily an English gentleman, and so he despised Napoleon because he thought Napoleon was not a gentleman.
While Bonaparte had been at his lowest ebb, Wellington had been lionized throughout Europe. But the English gentleman's superiority was about to be tested. Astonishingly, the two had never met. Now that looked set to change, and the outcome of that encounter could yet turn both their worlds upside down. In France, Bonaparte's advance was turning into a pageant. Town after town turned out to greet him, and every regiment sent to confront him instead joined his ranks.
The whole nature of the march changes from a very careful, covert military exercise into a triumphal progress.
C'était un meneur d'hommes. Il est passé là, et au fur et à mesure qu'il avançait, eh ben, il gagnait les gens à sa cause. C'est ce qui fait dire que c'était quelqu'un. Voilà.
Bonaparte had always feared the mob, but he now appealed to them shamelessly. The revolution made me, and now I've come to free the French people from slavery. The king took the hint. Fat Louis declared, stoutly, that he would die for his country, rather than submit to Bonaparte. But 3 days later, he fled to Paris. And the day after that, Napoleon entered it once more in triumph. He had arrived, as he'd sworn he would, on his son's birthday. Again he'd written to Mary Louise, "By the time you get this, I'll be in Paris. The people are flocking to me. Entire regiments are quitting and joining me. I hope to embrace you before the month is out." And this time the boast was true. He'd retaken the whole of France in under 3 weeks without firing a shot.
He's done it. He is still the gambler. He is also still the military leader. The great problem, of course, that he hasn't thought about is where on earth he's going to lead everyone to.
Bonaparte would have to reinvent himself, to persuade enemies at home and abroad that he was a changed man. In his own flowery hand, he wrote to the Prince Regent in England, "The first wish of my heart is an honourable peace." The letter was pointedly returned to Bonaparte unopened.
Napoleon wants peace, he needs peace. But of course the Allied sovereigns and the Allied governments, they've heard all this before. They simply don't believe him.
The response of the Allied governments was unequivocal. Bonaparte was an enemy and disturber of the peace of the world. By returning to France, he had delivered himself up to la vindicte publique, public justice. He was outside any law.
What they're actually saying is that this man is an outlaw and can be killed by anybody, by any means, without falling under the law. In other words, you can go and assassinate him if you want to.
It was to be a war against one man. But to mobilize the great armies of Russia and Austria in the east would take time. In the short term, the burden would fall on the small Allied forces already on France's northern border. The Prussian army, under their veteran commander von Blücher, and a hodgepodge of British and Dutch units, which Wellington would command. When Wellington took up his post in Flanders, he was appalled at what he found. More than half of his troops spoke German, a language of which he had no knowledge. Others, Dutch or Belgian, had until recently been loyal to Napoleon. It was a mongrel army.
But Wellington finds himself commanding an army where orders are being given in 4 different languages, where everybody's wearing different uniforms. There's a whole plethora of different weapons, different systems of ammunition, different systems of training, different rations. So trying to weld them together into a unified, homogeneous body is very, very difficult.
The British made up only 1 in 10 of Wellington's troops. He wasn't greatly impressed by them either. "I have got an infamous army, very weak and ill-equipped, and a very inexperienced staff." In Paris, Bonaparte was trying a new charm offensive on the French. "No more war, no more conquests. I intend to reign in peace and make my subjects happy." In an elaborate ceremony, he presented himself as a sovereign who, henceforth, would be the servant of his subjects, a constitutional monarch. But this was a new king dressed in old clothes. The emperor's old clothes from his coronation 10 years before. It was a transparent piece of theatre. Presented with the Constitution, Bonaparte accepted it with gritted teeth. "You are weakening me and chaining me. It is not in my nature to be an angel." Something that many in France knew only too well.
France is a very divided country. Napoleon was a symbol of the revolution. He was a symbol of everything that divided France, and the French lined up accordingly in 1815, as they always had.
Lining up behind Bonaparte was the army. The troops were as uncomfortable as their leader with the new face of France. To the country at large, Bonaparte insisted that he yearned for a long era of peace. To the army, the rhetoric was different. "Let us march on the enemy. Every Frenchman is a soldier. Victory will follow our eagles." The cries of "Vive l'Empereur" from the soldiers were deafening. It was possible to believe that nothing had changed. But as the 101 gun salutes ricocheted around Paris, other shouts were heard, ones with poignant echoes. "Long live the Empress, Marie Louise, and long live the King of Rome, Bonaparte's son. Let's go and fetch them," shouted his ever-loyal troops. But Napoleon remained silent. This was one charade that he could play no longer. Weary of the long separation from Bonaparte and unaware of his efforts to contact her, Marie-Louise had taken a lover, the one-eyed Count Adam von Neipperg. She was already expecting his child. As Bonaparte turned to the business of war, he at last appeared frank with those he now wanted closest to him, the marshals of his army. The truth is, I'm alone in the face of Europe. Are you going to abandon me? It was a heartfelt question. Betrayal by his marshals had brought him to the brink of suicide once. Now, with their Bourbon king gone, these same men had turned their coats again and come back to Bonaparte. Commanders like Ney, who had vowed to bring him back in an iron cage, and Soult, who had publicly called him a traitor. In the coming battle, these were the men he and France would be relying on. As Bonaparte prepared for war, he made his peace with the marshals who had betrayed him. Commanders like Ney and Soult had won victories throughout Europe. Now France needed them again. In Belgium, the British and Prussian armies were assembling, and where other men saw danger, Bonaparte spied an opportunity.
He can either sit still and do nothing, or he can stake everything on one final throw, one great gamble, and he can strike first. If he can move very quickly and in secret, he may be able to destroy the Prussians and the British before they can join up.
Bonaparte calculated his chances, and so began the long weekend that would lead to Waterloo. He threw his army across the border in a lightning strike, splitting it into two wings. With the right, he would take on the Prussians. The left wing he delegated to Marshal Ney. He ordered him to seize a strategic junction, Quatre Bras, and advance on Brussels. For every Frenchman with a heart, the moment has come to conquer or perish. He had caught the Allies cold. Wellington's intelligence sources, usually good, had failed him. His troops were far from battle-ready and still spread out across Belgium.
Napoleon's success in assembling his army and moving it and crossing the border, virtually in total secrecy, was a considerable achievement. Wellington knows that there is activity on the Prussian front. His difficulty is this the real thrust, or is it just a feint?
What Wellington feared from Bonaparte was a strike to the west, through Mons, to cut the British off from the Channel ports. Believing reports of a head-on attack must be a ruse, he refused to be drawn. He would watch and wait. That same evening, as Bonaparte bedded down on Belgian soil, Wellington, unsuspecting, was at a ball in Brussels. He was hoping to calm the frayed nerves of anxious guests. Then came urgent news. The French objective was unmistakable. It was Brussels itself. Napoleon has humbugged me, by God. He has gained 24 hours' march on me. Wellington had to move fast, to concentrate his scattered units on the crossroads of Quatre Bras and block the French advance. Today, Quatre Bras looks unremarkable. In 1815, it was the key to Bonaparte's fortunes, the point where his route north sliced between the Prussians and the British. This was the junction that Bonaparte had ordered Marshal Ney to capture the day before. Yet curiously, Ney had hesitated. Now, as Wellington began to reinforce the position, the odds were mounting against the French. Bonaparte's dispatch to Ney was pointed. There is no time to lose. Attack with the greatest urgency, everything in front of you. As battle drew near, Wellington met his ally, Field Marshal von Blücher, a veteran of Prussia's long wars against France, still in the saddle at 72 years old. He wanted revenge for his country.
Blücher just wanted to kill Frenchmen, and Napoleon in particular. He was a great character. He was a big, bluff sort of man. He was said to live on a diet of gin, onions and coffee when in the field. The soldiers knew him as Marshal Vorwärts for his favourite order, which was simply, forward, let's go and kill Frenchmen.
It was important for Wellington and Blücher to work in harmony, but since neither spoke the other's language, that wasn't easy. Almost 200 years later, the plan of action agreed that day is still disputed.
Wellington reassured Blücher that should the Prussians come under pressure from the French, he would immediately come to their aid by securing and supporting their right flank. And there's every reason to believe that that is what the Prussians expected Wellington's forces would do. For example, there's no other way of making sense of the Prussian dispositions, which left the right flank very exposed, precisely because they assumed there would be this assistance from Wellington's forces.
Wellington always insisted that he had offered support, but only on certain conditions.
Wellington said to Blücher, I will come and assist you, provided that I am not attacked myself. What the Prussians would have liked would have been for the whole of the Anglo-Dutch army to come across, in which case they would have outnumbered the French.
Bonaparte was committed to fighting 2 battles at once, 6 miles apart, against the Prussians at the village of Ligny and the Anglo-Dutch at Quatre Bras. His orders were simple. The fate of France is in your hands. Crush them. Ride them down. At Quatre Bras, it was an afternoon of mayhem. By dusk, the bodies of some 4,000 French and 5,000 Anglo-Dutch were strewn across the marshy ground. It was a stalemate. At Ligny, only darkness saved the Prussians from complete rout. Bonaparte set out to crush them and almost succeeded. 20,000 Prussians were killed or maimed, 14,000 French. Blücher, leading from the front, had his horse shot under him. The Prussian General Staff looked in vain for help from their British allies.
As the situation at Ligny deteriorates for the Prussians, they send out desperate scouts trying to find out where is Wellington, where are the Wellington forces that we were promised, and eventually it becomes clear that there are no forces.
Bonaparte was expecting the defeated Prussians to go east, to head for home and leave the British to fend for themselves. That, for him, would have been the rational thing to do. But Blücher didn't work on reason. He worked on passion, a passion for killing Frenchmen. He rallied his troops to fight another day and pulled back north to the town of Wavre.
Many military thinkers, many strategists would say, no, what you've got to do is go back towards Prussia, towards where your reinforcements are coming, towards where all your supplies are. Wellington certainly considered to have been the most important decision of the 19th century, to go northwards where they could stay in contact with the British.
Napoleon often spoke of the favourable moment which in war decides everything. That Saturday morning was, for him, such a moment, and inexplicably he lost it. His energy lapsed into lethargy. He spent the morning brooding on yesterday's victory, convinced he had the Prussians and the British on the run. When Bonaparte did stir himself, it was to order the untried Marshal Grouchy to hunt down the supposedly fleeing Prussians. He entrusted 30,000 men to him, a third of the entire army, and to find this phantom enemy, he sent him east. Wellington knew better. Unbeaten at Quatre Bras, but with his flank exposed by Blucher's retreat, he pulled back north, like his ally. "Blucher has had a damn good licking and gone back to Wavre," he said. "I suppose in England they will say we have been licked. I can't help it." As darkness fell, after a long march in pouring rain, Wellington turned to fight. His last-ditch defense of Brussels would be on a ridge he'd singled out a full year before, hard by the village of Waterloo. Sunday morning was still miserable. Not a good day to die. Across the shallow valley from the Allied lines, Bonaparte in his headquarters was trying to anticipate Wellington's plans. He was contemptuous of intelligence reports that the Prussians might join him. That is stupidity. After a battle like Ligny, it is impossible for them to join forces. Yet that was exactly what Wellington hoped to do. Overnight, he had sent a dispatch to Blucher saying he would stand at Waterloo, provided he could count on Prussian support. Blucher was eager to put the catastrophe at Ligny behind them. "Ill as I am, I will march at the head of my army to attack at once." It was a promise which Blucher would struggle to keep, but for Wellington it was enough. Reassured that Prussian reinforcements were coming, he prepared for his long-awaited encounter with Bonaparte.
They had never met in direct combat before. When you look at it from a personal point of view, this is epic. This is the stuff of myth.
For once, Bonaparte was fighting on ground chosen not by him, but by the enemy. Yet he was content. Wellington has thrown the dice, and they are in our favor. The battlefield was scarcely 2 miles wide, and the front lines were separated by less than a mile. Bonaparte had the satisfaction of outnumbering his rival both in men and guns. Ahead of him, Wellington had distributed his troops along the slight ridge that straddled the main road to Brussels. Below the ridge, he'd prepared 3 strong points to break up the French advance, ancient farm buildings that had been hurriedly fortified: Papelotte, La Haye-Sainte, and Hougoumont. Bonaparte favored a head-on attack and was in no mood for argument. Some of his marshals had fought Wellington before, but their protests met with a rebuff. "Because you have been beaten by Wellington, you think him a great general. I tell you, Wellington is a bad general. The English are bad troops, and we'll have them for breakfast." And yet breakfast came and went. Bonaparte wanted the ground to dry to deploy his guns.
Napoleon had an attacker's instinct to commit forces while supported by artillery. Wellington's instinct, as he showed at Waterloo, was to dig in.
Wellington's way of digging in, as those who knew him could have told Bonaparte, was to use the lie of the land. Napoleon, from his position, could see only a fraction of the opposing forces. Wellington concealed most of his troops on the slopes behind his ridge, away from the French guns. He used this dead ground to keep his men alive and out of sight, ready to be thrown into a counterattack, an attack which Wellington would depend on before the day was out. Napoleon spent the morning of Waterloo recalling past glories, parading his army in a show of force. He was killing time that Wellington needed. He had counted on Prussian help arriving by now. Bonaparte opened his 51st battle with the roar of cannon and an abrupt shift in his plans. He would lure Wellington into weakening his centre by staging a small diversion to the west, an attack on the farmstead of Hougoumont.
Just about where we are now, the first French soldiers erupt out of the wood, and they're straight into a killing area. The whole of this 20 yards between the edge of the wood, the garden wall and the chateau is open ground. It's a killing ground, and as they come out, they're met by a great belch of fire coming from all these loopholes, coming from men behind the walls, coming out of the roof. A few brave souls do get as far as the wall here and try to climb over it, and they're simply bayoneted. It is quite impossible to make any progress at all in this direction.
But the French persisted. Hougoumont became a point of honor. And having started this diversion, Bonaparte seemed unable to withdraw. Throughout the day, almost 13,000 French troops would be tied down fighting a handful of British. Napoleon's mind was elsewhere. It was time for his grand battery, concentrated firepower, to pulverize Wellington's centre, using the huge 12-pounders he called his belle fille, his beautiful daughters. In the far distance, suddenly, a smear of dust marked an approaching column. Blucher's Prussians, a good 4 hours away, but closing. Where, wondered Bonaparte, was Grouchy with his 30,000 men? He dictated a hurried dispatch. Do not lose an instant in moving towards us. Still to his troops, he appeared nonchalant. This morning we had 90 odds in our favor. We still have 60 against 40. If Grouchy marches rapidly, our victory will be decisive. Now he threw forward his infantry, 18,000 men in 4 dense columns, a display to break the spirit of the enemy. They were sitting targets for the British guns, but still came on. Past the fortified farm of La Haye-Sainte and up the slopes beyond. As they breasted the ridge, a Dutch brigade caught in the open turned tail and ran. There was a gap in the Allied lines. To Bonaparte, the battle seemed won. The British cavalry broke the green for him. A massed charge shattered the ranks of the French. Now the advantage was with Wellington, but only briefly. His cavalry outreached themselves, and as they struggled to regroup, Bonaparte launched a countercharge. Again, a bloody stalemate. To Bonaparte, the death toll was of little consequence. I will sacrifice 1,000,000 men if necessary, he had said in the past. But loss of time was important. They had been fighting for almost 4 hours, and apart from setting Hougoumont ablaze, achieved nothing. The Prussians were now only an hour away, and every passing minute counted to Wellington's advantage.
Wellington has to hold this ridge, stand here, stay on it, prevent the French from breaking through until at last the Prussians can come across to his help.
Bonaparte had to prise Wellington off his ridge and do it fast. What he needed was a lever to help him. La Haye-Sainte was the Allied outpost closest to their front line. If he could seize that, perhaps he could turn Wellington's defensive strongpoint against him and make it the springboard for his own army's final assault. Napoleon ordered Ney to take La Haye-Sainte at all costs. but something was wrong. Bonaparte did not wait to see his order carried out. Instead, he rode back behind the lines to rest.
Napoleon's energy is ebbing. He's on a downward curve. He's lost that sort of sure sense of what's possible and what's not.
The old magic seems in some way to have gone. Whatever the reason, he is certainly not at his best. One of his major mistakes probably was in effectively delegating the control of the battle to Ney, who wasn't up to it.
Under Bonaparte in Russia, the fiery Ney had been dubbed the bravest of the brave. Now, following his terrible hesitation at Quatre Bras, he was almost pathologically determined to prove himself. He made the Allied troops at La Haye-Sainte the targets of a ferocious assault, but still they held firm. In frustration, Ney lost his reason. Mistaking the movement of Allied wounded for a general retreat, he would not wait, but ordered a massive cavalry attack. He led the charge himself, crying, "Forward! The salvation of France is at stake." It was both magnificent and completely mad. In their defensive squares, the British were immovable. Bonaparte returned to the battlefield not believing what he saw, but recognizing the danger. This may have fatal results before the day is out. It is an hour too soon. Yet rather than rein in Ney's lunacy, Bonaparte reinforced it. He ordered more of the suicidal charges, saying, "We must stand by what has already been done." It was a gamble born of desperation. Napoleon had no other cards left to play, and it might just work.
He really showed unbelievable audacity, and it could have been a war-winning punch. It could have been the thing that pushed through Wellington's centre and split his army and forced him to retreat.
The solid ranks of the Allies were ready targets for the French guns, but still Napoleon's cavalry could not break them. Wellington was unimpressed, and having expected great things of Bonaparte, rather disappointed. Damn the fellow, he is a mere pounder after all. But under his frantic pounding, something had to give. The riflemen at La Haye-Sainte were running short of ammunition, and in blood and flames, the farm fell to the French. They were within 200 yards of the British lines. Wellington struggled to plug the gaps, but his front line was wavering. He prayed for intervention, either from Providence or from the Prussians. God bring me night, or bring me Blucher.
Wellington and his commanders were very worried about the whereabouts of the Prussians. As always happens in the confusion of war, some units lost their way, they took wrong turns, and one can easily imagine the immense frustration and anxiety of the British command.
All the French needed was one more push, but when Ney asked Bonaparte for fresh troops for the final breakthrough, the Emperor's response was unexpectedly bitter. Troops? Where the devil do you expect me to find them? Do you think I can make them? Napoleon did have troops, his favorites, the Imperial Guard, still standing in reserve. But where to put them? To the front where the British were weakening? Or to the rear, where he was suddenly vulnerable? The Prussians had taken the village of Plancenoit. He was fighting a battle on two fronts, and unthinkably, he was hesitating. Ask of me anything but time, was Bonaparte's maxim, and time was what he no longer had. It took precious minutes for him to decide to hazard everything against Wellington and bring up his cherished Imperial Guard. The outcome of the battle was in the balance.
I think he had this belief in the invincibility of the old guard. He thought he could do it all with these tried and tested veterans.
Across the valley, Wellington's assessment was bleak. Every Englishman on this field must stand and die on the spot that we now occupy. Like the rest of Europe, he knew the reputation of Bonaparte's guards. They called themselves the Immortals. They'd never known defeat. They had fought for Napoleon throughout the glory years. They had shared exile with him on Elba and hardship on the great trek back through France. Just 100 days before, they had entered Paris in triumph. Now, they stood ready to march once more for their emperor, their backpacks bulging with dress uniforms for the victory parade in Brussels. Suddenly, there was a commotion beyond the British lines. Large numbers of fresh troops were appearing. Could it be Marshal Grouchy and his 30,000 men? Bonaparte let it be known that it was, and the word was passed through the French ranks. A fatal untruth. As Napoleon well knew, it wasn't Grouchy entering the battle, but Blucher, coming to reinforce Wellington, as he had promised. The Immortals advanced with steady tread, as they had marched so many times. They were confident. All opposition seemed to have melted away in the smoke. Behind the ridge, beyond their sight, the British Guards lay waiting. As Bonaparte's old guard reached the brow, their enemy seemed to spring from the earth. The Immortals came on, in the face of the British muskets. Then they faltered, halted, and fell back. And on their flank, the men they had been told were Grouchy's division opened fire. It could only mean treason. Caught between the guns of the enemy facing them and the fear of treachery from their own ranks, the French army broke and fled the battlefield. It was every man for himself. And for Bonaparte, the end. Some 50,000 lay dead or dying. For the normally tight-lipped Wellington, too much to bear. Nothing is more horrible than a battle won, save one that has been lost. Bonaparte had no such thoughts. He left the field disconsolate and incredulous. Everything failed me just when everything had succeeded. He planned to fight again. It was not to be. He was dispatched to his second exile on St. Helena, a piece of rock in the South Atlantic, where he had all the time in the world to brood. To die is nothing, he wrote, but to live defeated is to die every day. And unable to face that thought, he reasoned that he had not lost the battle.
He blamed everyone for it, apart from himself. He blamed the right flank, he blamed the rain, he blamed all his commanders. He blamed treachery. He blamed everybody that he possibly could.
Napoleon was defeated. It was Napoleon who'd trained that army. It was Napoleon who'd promoted those generals. It was Napoleon who'd chosen them. He must take the blame in the same way as he must take the glory for his tremendous victories. He must also take the blame for his defeat.
Broken in spirit, Bonaparte died just 6 years later on St. Helena. 20 years on, his remains were brought once again to Paris by a nation intent on recapturing past glories. Before laying them to rest, the French dressed Bonaparte's bones for one last time in full military finery. Then, like a Russian doll, they were interred in not one, but 6 interlocking caskets of tin plate, lead, mahogany, ebony, and oak. Successive layers, shrouding a man, immortalizing a myth. A memorial in death to which he might have devoted his life.
The season continues next Monday. Details coming up. Find out more about Napoleon's empire at channel4.com/history. Movie romance next with 4. It was only a matter of time before Hollywood told their own Cyrano de Bergerac tale, and hands up, they've done it brilliantly well. Steve Martin, Daryl Hannah, and a massive nose well out of joint. Roxanne, here in minutes.
Under Napoleon's rule, the French army swept across Europe. The battles at Austerlitz, Jena and Waterloo cost thousands their lives. And transformed the relationship between armies and the state. The war against Napoleon season continues with the world in arms. Next Monday at 9 on 4.